Hello and welcome back to Mad Mouse Games. This is the first miniature that I am going to be painting from the Reaper Bones core set, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I paint my miniatures and what I think's good. So number one is your base coat. Let's define our terms a little bit. When I talk about a base coat, um, it's going to be your first and probably second layer of paint that you put on. So this is going to be enough to cover up any of the gray underneath and that kind of thing. And then also kind of a highlight layer on top of that. Now, let me talk a second about priming, because a lot of people use priming as their first thing. And again, I'm kind of a novice painter, and I'm not looking to spend lots of money and prime every model and spend that much time on it. And so I'm just here to show you that, look, this is possible with basically the bare necessities. As you can see here, I've got just a few paint brushes. The paints that I'm using are craft paints from the store that are like 50 cents for the whole thing, and that'll last you probably years in this hobby. Maybe not that long, depending on the color, but I mean, I just use craft paints, some simple brushes, and I don't do any of the other stuff. Like I said, I don't do priming, and I'll talk a little bit in the future. I plan on priming so I can see the difference when I'm a little more invested time-wise, and probably on some of my bigger projects I'll do that. But again, I just want to show, look, getting into this hobby, it's easy, it's simple, and it's not going to be your best work the first time. This is the first miniature I've done probably in, I don't know, 6 months or so. And so I'm getting back into it, and it's definitely not my best work. It did not come out looking, super professional or anything like that. But you slap it on a game table, and your players are going to say, wow, that's really cool. So, base coat, I always put down the lowest layer first and then move my way up to the surface layers of the miniature. So, in this case, you can kind of see it. I painted the blue kind of undershirt first, then I painted the red coat that's on top of that, then I painted the leather that's on top of that. I worked my way up to the surface, and that's how I like to do it. I also like to do it with darker colors than what I plan on having at the end. Now, the reason for this is that when you go over it with a wash, it's going to get darker anyways, and plus, I'm going to do a highlight on top of this darker layer before I do my first wash. So, with this, kind of what happens is I'll paint the lowest layer first, so I paint the blue undershirt first, and then if any of that blue paint gets on my red coat that I'm going to make, then when I paint the red coat, which is the next layer up, I can cover up that blue paint, therefore getting rid of any mistakes. This allows you to paint a little bit faster, and you just move up and up the miniature until you've gotten basically everything that you want to paint painted. And then you can move on to the next stage, which will be washes, which I'll talk about definitely later in this video. So now, when I talk about doing a highlight, I usually like to do it in a color that's lighter. If you wanted to, you could just add a little bit of white paint to whatever you use for the base coat or for the bottom coat. And then when you highlight, you want to do a pretty good job of highlighting. Because and don't worry about there being stark differences in the color between one base of paint and then your highlight base of paint, because when you do the wash, it will get rid of all of that. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that washes are your best friend when you're painting miniatures. Now, with your base coats and stuff like that, you want to make sure that you get basically as much of the miniature as you're going to paint. Every once in a while, there'll be a little piece that I won't base coat, and that's mostly going to be my metallics, because I either plan on coming in later and doing the metallics separately, because metallic paint's kind of weird to work with. Luckily, this miniature didn't have any metallics in it, but when I do a metallic one, I'll tell you a little bit about how I do metallic paints, because they can be tricky to work with sometimes. And of all the paints that I have, metallics are the only ones that I've gone out and bought actual paints for. I think I bought army paint. So let's talk about washes now. Washes is the most important thing that will ever happen to you in miniatures. So let's talk a little bit about what a wash does and then how I do washes, because I don't use an actual wash, although I will one day. So what's the purpose of a wash? Again, usually you'll have a highlight and then your lower base coat, and putting a wash on it makes it so that everything blends together nicely, so that it's not too stark different colors. Now it looks a lot more blended because it has this wash over the top of it. The other thing it does is it gets in all the recesses, and it will make your highlights pop out more. It will create another layer, another color of paint basically in the darker recesses, and it makes it look so good. Now, how I make my wash is 1 drop of black paint and a ton of water. And I just use craft paints because, like I said, I don't use any of the fancy stuff. It doesn't work the best, and you have to be careful when you do it because you want to make sure that it's pretty watered down. And by pretty watered down, I mean mostly water. But it will end up making your miniature look amazing when it's done. Seriously, wash your minis every time. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start talking about kind of like the final details that you're going to want to do to your miniature. So when I talk about final details, it's mostly just highlighting where you think there needs to be highlights, um, adding in little extra details, and dry brushing. Dry brushing is the big thing. Right here you can see this is how you dry brush. You take your paintbrush, you dip it in the paint, and you wipe off 90% of the paint. You'll then come back through and just brush it on your miniature. With this one, I didn't wait for my wash to dry because I kind of wanted it to mix in with the wash a little bit. However, I probably wouldn't do this again because it's very messy and you kind of have to come back through and dry brush again anyways. But as you can see, the dry brushing picks out kind of the high details. The wash brings in the low details or the recessed details. So this creates, so you might be using one paint or maybe two paints, but it looks like you've used 6 different colors on one material, even though you've only used 2 and a wash, because you have your base coat and your highlight, which then get covered by a wash, which will basically create 3 different colors. Then on top of the 3 different colors, you'll get your dry brush, which will create a 4th, and it creates some texture. It looks really good, plus it all blends together really well, and it's just easy to do. Dry brushing, I was very scared the first time that I dry brushed, to be honest, because I was like, oh, this mini, it looks pretty good. Like, I don't know if I want to dry brush because it might ruin it because I've never done it before. But my tricks for dry brushing, just go ahead and make sure you get off basically all the paint. Like you saw me do it a little bit earlier. Wipe it off on that paper towel, get it all off there, and it just will enhance your product. Now, at the end of the video, you'll kind of see what I did in the highlighting and different things I did for it. So I always like to dry brush first, and then usually I'll come back through with a detail brush, and I'll pick out a lot of the things that I was like, okay, maybe I dry brushed this too much. I kind of want it to go back to the original color a little bit, or oh, the dry brushing missed this tiny little spot because it couldn't really get down in there, and I'll fix that up. Now, when you go in with a fine detail brush, that is the one thing I would say definitely spend money on, is a good set of brushes. Because no matter what paints you use, no matter what kind of washes you use, no matter what kind of miniature you're painting, those small detail brushes will save you. This is the first time I've ever used this small of a detail brush, and let me tell you, it was amazing to use. My wife bought these for me a couple of months ago for my birthday, and I hadn't had the chance to try them until now, and it made my life so much easier. So you'll see on this little bottle I'm painting right now, going through with the detail brush, it was so easy and it just was amazing. So yes, get yourself a nice small detail brush, even if it's just one for this end step. Other than that, like you can use a fairly big brush compared to this detail brush for basically everything else, but this small details, this little brush, it just saved my bacon a lot. You can see right here, I'm picking out these tiny little strings on this, you know, like money pouch or whatever, and it looks really good, I think, um, for what it is. And these, again, get yourself a good detail brush. Other than that, you can paint a pretty good looking mini with just craft paints, water, and persistence. One day in the future, I will be getting like an official, I don't know if it'll be a Reaper's paint set or a Citadel or anything like that, but I will be getting one of those kind of paint sets and kind of doing a compare and contrast between, should you just go straight for professional paints or should you stick with craft paints for a while and see how it works? The nice thing about the craft paints is you can pick out the exact colors you need for about 50 cents. And if you're just getting into minis, you're like, I don't know if I'm really going to like it. For like $6, you can get, let's see, that's 12 different paints for $6 if they're 50 cents a piece. Like $12 and one package of miniatures at like $5 from your local gaming store. That's like less than $20. That leaves you $3 basically to spend on a nice brush that you can use in this fine detail step. Oh, and I take it back. Right here you can see this is metallic paints I'm putting on kind of the hilt of the sword and the base of the sword. And I like to put metallics on at the end if I want them to look like it's a brand new, shiny kind of sword, which I do in this case, because this is kind of like I would say a young player character or something like that. So I want them to look like they're kind of newer. So they're going to have a nice new looking brass looking sword um, to go with it. I also put some of it on the top of this staff, which I'd forgotten about as well, which I did not wash, but which I will go back and wash eventually. So another step I'm not going to talk about in this video is adding varnishes um, to your minis. So a matte varnish, a gloss varnish, any of that. Usually I do that, but with these miniatures, I know because it's my first time painting in a long while that I'm going to go back and add other details and maybe do extra washes and stuff. So I did not varnish this mini. However, I do recommend a good matte varnish on all minis when you're done with them because the paints will rub off. And again, maybe part of that is because I don't use any primer. So that's something I'm looking forward to looking at, comparing, contrasting. But as far as this miniature goes, it was just picking out details at the end here and seeing where things go. You can see here, so this technique where I kind of dab with the um, paper towel, that's just to wipe off any excess because I think I still had wash on it at the time, so adding the other paint, it all kind of ran together, and so I just used that to get rid of some of the paint and things like that. But so this is going to be the finished miniature, basically. You'll see in a little bit me kind of rotating it around so you can see all the parts. But I'll be painting more miniatures, just like this one, trying to get them to look good. And I mean, as you can see, this isn't perfect. You can see here on like the glove kind of areas, I think I dry brushed too much, but like this back little glass that's tied on, I think that looks great. And all these tiny little details I picked out with the detail brush was something I'd never done before and that I thought was really nice. So, anyways, I want to thank you for watching the video. Subscribe so you can see more of my stuff in the future. And I mean, thank you again for watching. Leave comments if there's any miniatures you want to see me paint, and have a nice day.